What you are about to hear is not a fairy tale. It happened under the blazing lights of Manhattan's Grand Astoria ballroom, a place where the walls themselves seemed stitched with old money. Crystal chandeliers dripped gold over a sea of tuxedos and gowns. Every table gleamed with polished silver and towers of roses, each seat costing more than what most Americans pay for their mortgage in a month. For the powerful, this was just another Tuesday night of self-congratulation. And yet, amid that glittering display, a storm was about to break. He sat at the center of it all, William Ashford IV, the heir to a dynasty that had stamped its name on half the skyline. Sandy blonde hair sculpted to perfection, a Rolex flashing at his wrist, and the lazy smirk of a man who had never once been told no. The champagne at his table flowed freely, and so did his arrogance. By the second bottle, he was no longer drinking to celebrate. He was drinking to perform, to remind everyone watching that power was his natural state. But the true heart of this story did not sit beneath a chandelier. It moved quietly between the tables, carrying trays of Dom Perignon, with hands that once reached for something greater. Elena Carter, 27 years old, shoulders squared in a uniform designed to be invisible. Her shoes were worn, her back ached, and in her purse, hidden from every eye, was the fresh sting of another rejection letter. 4 years had passed since she had set down her pointe shoes, 4 years since a family tragedy forced her to trade the dream of the stage for endless shifts under the chandeliers of the rich. No one at that gala cared about her name. To them, she was part of the machinery of the night, a ghost who appeared with champagne and vanished before her presence could be acknowledged. But William Ashford's eyes found her, and in them glittered not curiosity, not kindness, but cruelty dressed as amusement. The orchestra swelled with a tango rhythm, and William leaned back in his chair, the very picture of entitlement. He pulled out a fat stack of bills, $10,000 in crisp notes, and let them fan out in his hand like a magician's trick. His voice, thick with cheap champagne, carried easily across the table and beyond. "Dance with me," he declared, pointing at the waitress who had dared to exist in his line of sight. "Right here, right now. $10,000 if you don't make a fool of yourself. But stumble, fail, and you're out of a job." A ripple moved through the ballroom. Conversations died mid-sentence. Champagne flutes froze halfway to painted lips. The music seemed to sharpen, as if even the band was listening. For Elena, the world slowed. $10,000. 2 years of her mother's medication. A security deposit on a better apartment. A lifeline dangled before her, but laced with venom. This was not generosity. It was not an invitation. It was a public spectacle, a cruel dare meant to humiliate. And as every gaze in that gilded room turned toward her, Elena Carter realized this was no longer just a party. It was a trial, and the verdict would be written in front of everyone. For one suspended moment, Elena Carter could hear nothing but the thud of her own pulse. Every instinct screamed at her to retreat, to slip through the service door and vanish into the safety of the kitchens. She could already picture her manager's horrified face, the whispers of the staff, the shame of walking away under the weight of William Ashford's smirk. It would have been so easy to disappear. But then her eyes locked on his, those cold, gleaming eyes of a man who had never once tasted humility. The certainty in them was unbearable. He wasn't just daring her. He was certain she would fold, certain she would cower, certain that money could define the boundaries of her existence. And that certainty struck something deep inside her chest, something she thought had been buried long ago. Slowly, deliberately, Elena set her tray down on a nearby stand. The ballroom held its breath. She reached behind her back, untied the starched white apron that marked her as invisible labor, and folded it once, twice, 3 times, with the care of someone performing a ritual. She laid it gently on the tray, as if burying a part of herself, Then with a quiet exhale, she looked down at her shoes scuffed practical built to endure 16-hour shifts. Shoes that had carried her through years of thankless work, but had also tethered her to servitude. She slipped one off, then the other. The sound of the soles hitting the thick carpet was soft, but in the silence, it landed like a drumbeat. Barefoot now in nothing but black socks, she straightened her spine. Something in her posture changed. She was no longer the ghost waitress drifting from table to table. Without the apron, without the armor of uniform, she was suddenly taller, sharper visible. A murmur rippled through the crowd. At first it was confusion, then a rising edge of fascination. These were people used to control, used to scripts that never wavered yet. Here was a servant rewriting the story before their eyes. William's grin faltered, just for a heartbeat. He had expected trembling compliance, a spectacle of weakness. What he saw instead was theater. Elena took one slow step toward the open space between the tables, then another. The crystal chandeliers caught in her dark hair, giving her a faint crown of light. Her hands no longer clutched a tray, they hung loose at her sides, steady ready. For the first time all night, William Ashford looked uncertain. The orchestra continued the tango's rhythm, gathering heat. Somewhere at the back of the room, a guest whispered, "She's really going to do it." Another hissed, "This isn't part of the program." The murmurs swelled, not unlike the rustle of an audience before the curtain rises. Elena inhaled slowly, her chest lifting, her gaze never breaking from William's. In that gaze was defiance, pain, and something stronger than both resolve. The crowd didn't see a waitress anymore. They saw a woman about to step into battle not with fists or words, but with movement. And in that instant, the stage was set. The band shifted, violins cutting sharp into the air as the opening strains of Astor Piazzolla's Libertango surged through the ballroom. The rhythm was hot, insistent, a sound that demanded attention. Conversation stopped. Waiters froze mid-step. The music itself seemed to challenge the silence. William Ashford rose with exaggerated flourish, the predator still convinced he owned the room. He extended his hand toward Elena, lips curled in a smirk that promised humiliation. She accepted his hand without flinching, her expression unreadable, her body steady as stone. He pulled her close in a rigid tango frame posture, textbook perfect but cold mechanical. He expected her to stumble, to drag her feet like someone lost in a foreign language. And at first she did follow. Step, step, pivot, her movements, pliant, obedient, exactly what he imagined. He flashed his fiancée a look of smug satisfaction. See, just another servant dancing on command. But then came the third step. Elena's weight shifted with sudden precision, her body turning not as a follower, but as an equal force. The line of her arm tightened, her frame electric. She anticipated his lead and transformed it, spinning not awkwardly, but with a speed and fire that startled him off balance. The air left his lungs in a grunt as his perfect posture cracked. A gasp rippled through the crowd. Cameras clicked. William the heir, who had never tasted defeat, had just stumbled. And Elena was no longer the invisible waitress. She was fire. She slid across the carpet in her socks, as if the floor were made for her. Every movement carried not just technique, but memory. The memory of studios, of rehearsals, of stage lights she had once thought lost forever. The tango was not steps to her. It was defiance, made flesh. William tried to recover, forcing her into a complicated giro he had practiced in private lessons. But Elena met his maneuver and embellished it with a sharp gancho, her leg hooking his with breathtaking audacity. The crowd gasped again, half in shock, half in wonder. The air faltered. He was no longer leading, he was surviving. His movements became clumsy, reactive, jerky against her command. He looked less like a master of the floor and more like a marionette, strings pulled tight by the woman in his arms. And still, Elena pressed forward. She dipped low hair, brushing the floor, eyes blazing up at him with a challenge he could not answer. The orchestra swelled, violins screaming as the melody reached its crescendo. She spun him in circles, her feet tracing patterns he could not match until the room blurred into light and color. Finally, with one last surge of strength, she broke free of his grip and spun away, landing in a dramatic pose at the center of the floor. Arms, extended chest, heaving chin, lifted toward the chandeliers. For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Dozens of cameras froze the moment in flashes of light. William stood abandoned in the middle of the ballroom, red-faced, panting, utterly humiliated. Then the silence shattered. It began with one pair of hands, clapping, hesitant but bold. Then another, and another. Within seconds, the Grand Astoria was on its feet, roaring with applause. It wasn't polite society applause. It was the thunder of a crowd witnessing something unforgettable. The ovation poured over Elena like a tide. For the first time in years, she felt the stage lights again, not on Broadway, but here in the most unlikely of places. And in that moment, Elena Carter was no longer a servant. She was a dancer reborn. The ovation still thundered when William Ashford's face hardened, flushing crimson. His jaw-clenched, eyes narrowed, and the carefully groomed air could not bear what the room had just witnessed. For the first time in his charmed life, he was not the spectacle. He was the fool. With jerky movements, he reached into his jacket, fingers clawing at his silver monogrammed money clip. He yanked it free, ripped out the stack of $100 bills, and without flourish, without charm, hurled the money at her feet. The cash scattered in the air, fluttering like green and white confetti. It rained down across the plush carpet in slow motion, a storm of insult disguised as generosity. The ovation faltered into murmurs. Guests leaned forward, champagne forgotten. $10,000. For Elena Carter, the sight of it struck like a blade. She could see the prescriptions it would pay for 2 years of her mother's medicine. She could picture a better apartment, rent covered for months, the relief of bills finally cleared. Every practical instinct in her screamed to bend down, gather it up, swallow the insult, and survive. But then she looked at William's face. There was no remorse there. No grace. Only the bitter fury of a spoiled man, desperate to reclaim power. His eyes burned with hatred, daring her to kneel, to reduce herself to the role he had written for her, a servant who knew her price. And in that instant, Elena understood. If she stooped to collect those bills, she would be confirming his truth that dignity could be bought, that art could be sold, that her fire on the dance floor was worth no more than a stack of paper. She let the silence stretch. Her gaze lifted, locking onto his, and when she spoke, her voice carried with a clarity sharper than any violin. "I think you misunderstand," she said. "I didn't dance for your money. I danced for me." The words cut the air clean in two. Gasps rippled across the tables. One guest's hand flew to her pearls. Another muttered, "My God." No one moved. They all felt the weight of what had just been said. Elena bent only to retrieve what belonged to her, not the bills, but the folded apron she had left on the tray. She picked it up, tucking it under her arm with the care of a soldier reclaiming a banner. Her sensible shoes dangled from her other hand. Then she turned chin high and began walking across the ballroom. Past William, past his entourage, past the stunned faces of New York's elite. Each step was unhurried, deliberate, the stride of a woman who refused to scurry, who carried herself with the poise of a queen, abdicating a throne she never wanted. Behind her, the money lay strewn across the floor, untouched, a silent monument to a power that had failed. For a long moment, the room stayed hushed, as if no one quite knew how to breathe. And in that stillness, respect blossomed, not just for the skill of her dance, but for the strength of her refusal. Elena Carter did not just win the ovation. She won the room's reverence. The ballroom had fallen into silence after Elena's words, but the world outside would not remain quiet for long. Cameras had been flashing all night, society photographers, influencers, guests who couldn't resist capturing the drama on their phones. By the time the last champagne flute was cleared, the images had already begun their journey. Before sunrise, the photos were online. The first, William Ashford IV holding a fan of $100 bills, smugness painted across his face. The second, Elena Carter caught mid-spin, hair fanned out like a bannerized burning with life. And the third, the one that would sear itself into memory, Elena walking away, barefoot, apron folded in her arm, leaving $10,000 scattered across the carpet behind her. The images carried a story no caption could soften. By morning, your Buster ballroom dancer was trending across the nation. Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, the platforms filled with commentary memes and furious threads. News outlets scrambled to frame the narrative, heiress humiliated servant becomes star dance of defiance. But the story did not stay confined to headlines. Strangers began to act. Someone launched a GoFundMe called a tip jar for the dancer. The goal was modest $10,000 to match the money she left behind. By breakfast, the number had doubled. By lunch, it soared past 50,000. People wrote messages alongside their donations for your mother's medicine, for dignity that can't be bought, for reminding us that art is priceless. In diners across the Midwest, in living rooms on the West Coast, in retirement communities in Florida, people watched the clip and nodded. They weren't cheering just for Elena Carter. They were cheering for themselves, for every insult swallowed, every moment of being unseen, every time they wished they had found the courage to stand tall. It was no longer the story of a waitress. It was a parable of dignity. Yet high above Central Park, inside the glass and steel fortress of Ashford Tower, the mood was anything but reverent. Charles Ashford, William's father, paced his mahogany-lined office with the fury of a general watching his empire crumble. The morning papers lay across his desk, each one a fresh wound. The New York Post splashed William's red face under the headline, "Tango of the Tyrant." Investors were calling. Board members were restless. The Ashford name, once synonymous with power, was now a punchline. Billions of dollars trembled at the edge of perception, for reputation was currency in their world, and reputation was bleeding out. Charles slammed his fist against the desk, rattling a line of crystal paperweights. All of this he spat because my son couldn't resist humiliating a waitress. He understood something William did not. Money could buy silence, but it could not buy back respect once it was lost. This waitress, this Elena Carter, was no longer a face in the crowd. She was a symbol, and symbols Charles knew were dangerous. For the first time in his long career, he felt a tremor of something unfamiliar. Not fear of a rival corporation, not fear of regulators, but fear of a story that had slipped beyond his control. While the Ashfords scrambled to contain their crisis, another figure had already fixed his gaze on Elena Carter. Victor Marlowe, the name alone, enough to hush any Broadway rehearsal hall. For 3 decades, his productions had filled theaters and etched themselves into the marrow of American stage history. He was a legend, but in recent years, a weary one, dulled by endless galas and polite conversations that led nowhere. At the Grand Astoria that night, he had been on the verge of leaving half-bored, nursing a glass of brandy, unimpressed by the endless parade of speeches and self-congratulation. But when Elena took the floor barefoot, and burning something inside him snapped awake. He leaned forward, heart-racing eyes alight with a hunger he had not felt in years. He wasn't watching a dare anymore. He was watching art. The very next morning, a knock rattled the thin door of Elena's modest queen's apartment. Blinking against the gray light, still reeling from the storm of calls and texts on her cracked phone, she opened it to find a sharply dressed woman holding an embossed card. "My name is Margaret Sloan," the woman said with clipped professionalism. "I'm Mr. Marlowe's assistant. He requests your presence at his studio tomorrow morning. 10 o'clock sharp." Elena stared at the card as if it might dissolve in her hands. Gregory Bishop had been the stuff of dreams for other stories. Hers was Victor Marlowe. A man she had studied in textbooks, whose productions she had once imagined herself joining. And now, impossibly, he was inviting her in. The next day, she stepped into a rehearsal space that felt like stepping back in time. The studio sat atop an old pre-war building in the theater district's sunlight, spilling through tall windows, the wooden floors scarred from decades of relentless practice. Photographs of past triumphs lined the walls, dancers frozen mid-leap costumes, immortalized in black and white. The air smelled faintly of sweat polish and ambition. Victor Marlowe stood at the center, wiry and compact, his silver hair wild as ever. His eyes were piercing, and as they studied Elena, she felt both stripped bare and strangely seen. "You didn't just dance the other night," he said, voice raspy from years of shouting direction across cavernous theaters. "You inhabited the music. That cannot be taught." He circled her slowly like a craftsman, appraising a rare material. "I recognize the training. Donovan Academy, wasn't it?" Elena's breath caught. "Yes, I was there. I didn't graduate," I know, Victor said softly. I checked. "Top of your class for 3 years. Winner of the choreography prize. And then you vanished." The words unlocked a door she had kept bolted. She spoke haltingly, voice weighted with memory. Her father, a man who had poured his life into a small construction company in Brooklyn. The biggest contract of his career, a luxury condo project, pulled away on a fabricated technicality. Loans defaulted, equipment repossessed. The stress triggered a massive heart attack. He survived, but the family was broken, drowning in debt and hospital bills. "I dropped out to keep us afloat," she confessed. "Waitressing paid the bills when nothing else did." Victor's sharp expression softened with a flicker of empathy. But then Elena added the final bitter note. "The developer who destroyed us was owned by Ashford Corp." The room seemed to still. Victor stopped pacing, eyes widening with dawning recognition. "Ashford," she nodded. "I didn't know it that night at the gala. Not until I saw William's full name in the papers. The family that ruined my father's life is the same family that dared me to dance." For a moment, silence stretched like a drum roll. The irony was brutal, almost biblical. The very dynasty that had crushed her dreams had also, through arrogance, thrown her back into the light. Victor's voice broke the quiet, low but certain. "I've been searching for someone to carry the lead in my new production. Hundreds auditioned. None had what I saw in you that night." He stepped closer, eyes blazing with the conviction of an artist who knew destiny when it stood before him. "I'm not offering you an audition, Miss Carter. I'm offering you the role." The words struck Elena like thunder. The dream she had buried beneath years of exhaustion and grief had just been laid at her feet again. And this time, she was ready to rise. Elena Carter's days no longer began with the clatter of trays and the ache of 16-hour shifts. They began with music. At dawn, she laced up her practice shoes in Victor Marlowe's rehearsal studio, the scarred oak floor beneath her feet, whispering of dancers past. Each movement brought pain muscles long dormant, protested every lift, every spin. Yet beneath the ache burned something stronger, the fire she had carried out of the ballroom. While Elena rebuilt herself for the stage, the Ashfords scrambled to rebuild their collapsing empire. William Ashford IV, once the golden heir, now stood before a forest of microphones at a hastily arranged press conference. His bespoke suit could not hide the tremor in his voice. Reading from a sheet of prepared remarks, he spoke of regret, of lessons learned. But the words rang hollow, delivered without conviction, eyes fixed not on the cameras, but on the floor. The reporters smelled blood. Questions flew like arrows. "Mr. Ashford, have you apologized to Elena Carter personally? Is it true your company bankrupted her father? Security hustled him away before answers could be given." The performance fooled no one. If the dance had been his public downfall, the apology became his public burial. And then the deeper story broke. Not from the Ashfords, but from Elena herself. With journalist Daniel Cross, one of the few who had treated her story with dignity from the beginning, she opened the door on the truth. Together, they traced the paper trail, the contracts riddled with loopholes, the deliberate sabotage of her father's company, the lives ground down under Ashford Corp's steel wheels. The article was titled simply, "The Dancer's Debt." It hit the internet like a thunderclap. Within hours, regulators announced inquiries. Investors pulled back. Politicians, eager for headlines, called for hearings. The Ashford name, once a monolith, had become toxic. Money could buy silence, but it could not erase a story told with courage. For Elena, the ovation she once thought fleeting had grown into something larger. It was no longer just applause in a ballroom. It was a chorus of strangers across the nation, voices rising together to say, "We see you. We believe you. We stand with you." Weeks later, as she stood in the wings of a Broadway theater, Elena's breath came fast, but not from fear. The house lights dimmed. The orchestra tuned. And then the stage manager whispered the words she had once thought she would never hear, "You're on." She stepped into the glow of the stage lights, their heat washing over her like a baptism. The audience hushed, expectant, waiting. This was not the grand Astoria ballroom. This was Broadway. And Elena Carter was not a servant slipping unnoticed between tables. She was the lead. She was the story. She was her own voice. She didn't just reclaim her art, she reclaimed her life. And as the curtain falls, one truth lingers: our worth is never measured in wealth or family names, but in the courage to stand tall when the world tells us to bow. Elena Carter's dance reminds us that dignity, once reclaimed, can light a path brighter than any chandelier. If her journey moved you, we'd love to hear your thoughts. Share in the comments what moment struck you most. And if you believe in stories that prove it's never too late to rise again, make sure you subscribe so you won't miss the next one.